Today we're going to be talking about one of the most common climbing injuries and how we're going to rehab that. My name is Harley and I'm the designer here at Lattice, and I'm joined today by James.
Hi, I'm James. I'm a physiotherapist from the Sheffield Climbing Clinic. I specialise in treating climbers. Basically, Harley presented to me in the clinic, and he said that he had been having pain in the base of his left middle finger, and it was about 2.5 months that you'd been having that pain. So yeah, just remind us of what happened.
Yeah, so I'd upped my training load. I was preparing for a trip to Font, and that increase in load, I started getting pain in the base of my finger, and that was an indication, kind of when that pain didn't go away, that I needed to go and get a scan and see James in the clinic.
Yeah, and I think I remember there wasn't like a sort of specific incident where you sort of pulled really hard and heard like a pop or something like that. It kind of almost like gradually came on, wasn't it?
The pain presented itself in kind of at the end of a session, and then it grew and grew. And not a huge amount of pain, but it was there and it was consistently there.
Yeah, and that's something that I kind of really commonly see with climbers, this sort of potentially a period where they've decreased volume or intensity. As I say, we saw a lot of that throughout the lockdowns, and then things opened up, or you were able to travel again, and for example, you going on a trip to Font and just get that psych to train, get strong, and things like that. And again, that if you have like a real classic like a pulley tear or something like that, it's quite obvious and you can't really continue to train. But in Harley's example, it was one of those where there was some background pain, but he could kind of keep training. And then there's that thing of, well, it's not that bad and it settles, but then it's still there. And then a couple of months down the line, it's kind of become a bit more of a major thing, hasn't it? So yeah, as you say, you'd had a couple of months where this kind of finger injury was just sort of there, wasn't it? It wasn't really changing as such, despite some of the stuff you'd done. So the first thing we did really is have an assessment, and it was the classic things of, it was sore in half crimp, sore in full crimp. It was sore to kind of push at the base of your finger. So what we did then is did a ultrasound scan, a diagnostic ultrasound scan, and what that does is allows us to sort of look inside the finger. And basically what we saw is that this was just an A2 pulley strain or irritation. And it's important to get that sort of correct diagnosis, because there's a couple of things. It could be a pulley tear, for example, a tenosynovitis, which is like inflammation of the tendon sheath, or just a flexor tendon strain. And the way that you would manage and rehab those is all kind of very, very different. So it can be a little bit confusing, because you get a diagnosis of a strain, or an irritation. You think, well, how has that been going on for so long? It's nothing too major. But that's the point. It's not too major, so that's why you could carry on for 2 months. You know what I mean? So getting that right diagnosis was important, and then that's when we could go on to the rehab. The first thing we did is spoke about your climbing and training load. So one of the things that we had to change is the sort of volume and intensity of your climbing. You were still at that point doing some fingerboarding, and you were still climbing reasonably intensely, because you were saying like, well, it kind of is about the same if I train or not, so I kind of just want to keep training and things like that. So the first thing we did is completely discuss and talk about how we can change that to allow the finger to kind of settle and then hopefully ramp it back up. But one of the things that I did recommend was doing some loading of the finger, but at a reduced capacity. So for example, you were fingerboarding on a overhead fingerboard, but the one thing that I like to use a lot with climbers' finger injuries is the sort of the pickup devices.
So why do you like to use pickup training devices as opposed to dead hanging off a fingerboard? So
there's a couple of reasons really. With the main thing is that the decreased intensity. You can use a normal fingerboard with weight taken off, for example, using like a pulley system. But say, for example, you want to specifically load one hand, to be able to take enough weight off so you can do a low level of loading and actually a higher level of volume, because when you're rehabbing, you might fingerboard, I don't know, twice a week on a normal fingerboard, whereas with rehab, you can actually load the fingers on a daily basis. So the key with rehab often, like training, is consistency. So to be able to get the loads low enough to be able to load your fingers every day and not get too fatigued, single arm on a normal fingerboard, it's a bit of a faff basically, isn't it? You know, setting up a pulley system and doing that. And a lot of people don't have pulley systems at home. So with a portable device, you can put 5 kilograms, 10 kilograms, things like that, have it in your living room, and you can be kind of lifting and loading it on a daily basis. Okay, so we used the quad block for the rehab of Harley's finger. So the 3 grip types we decided on for Harley was the wide pinch, like so. We also used a 3-finger drag on the 30mm edge, and also a 4-finger half crimp. Okay, so let's go through those grip types in a bit more detail. The first one we did was a 3-finger drag. So 3-finger drag is where you're using these front 3 fingers here. Little finger isn't engaged at all, and you're in this kind of open hand position, okay? And then we can lift like so. And the reason we do that is because the 3-finger drag puts less stress through the pulley system than a half crimp. We obviously use the half crimp as well, but what the 3-finger drag means is you can put higher levels of load sooner without pain compared to the half crimp. So yeah, let's quickly go through that half crimp. So it's the same position, same edge, but this time you're using all 4 fingers and you want to get into this half crimp position. So that's characterized by all the 4 fingers, and you want to look at this sort of PIP front joint here, middle joint here, sorry, as being at about 90 degrees, and then you're in that position and you're lifting up like so. In terms of using the half crimp, we use this because it more specifically loads the pulley itself, and that will trigger an adaptive response by the body and therefore get it stronger and more tolerant to load. And it's one of the grips that was the most painful for Harley when he was climbing and training. And then the last grip type we used was the wide pinch. So that is using the top wide pinch here. And again, we can lift up like so. And the reason we used this one is the wide pinch will load the pulley to a certain extent, but a lot of the rationale behind that one was when you're rehabbing, and this is what a lot of climbers ask us, you know, am I going to lose a load of strength? How can I maintain that? And actually the pinch grip is a nice one to include just to maintain some climbing specific strength. In terms of the sort of protocol we decided on, we were doing the 3 different grip types, and we were doing 3 repetitions of 30-second holds, okay? And we were actually doing that on a daily basis. And actually with rehabilitation, often the frequency of loading the tissue can be much higher than you would do if you were, say, training normal fingerboarding. And the reason for that is because we actually want to stimulate the tissue and get that sort of response by the body and the brain to kind of adapt that tissue. And really with the injury that Harley had, being an A2 pulley strain, that can cope with some daily loading. The reason that we did the 30 seconds is because there's some kind of evidence to show that what we call long duration, you might have heard of them called density hangs, things like that, can actually have a little bit of a pain relieving effect on tissue. And also with the long duration, it means that you can maybe get a bit more effect out of lower loads, rather than if you say do a 10-second lift, by the time you've loaded the tissue, you've almost kind of put it down before you've picked it up. Because the other thing that we want to do as well is it's important to understand with rehab that you are helping to desensitize the tissue. Fingers are notorious for being what we call pain sensitive. So doing these long duration hangs can actually teach your brain and encourage your brain not to be so sensitive to the load. One of the obvious important considerations is, well, how much load do we use when we're doing these exercises, and when do you progress, and is it okay to have pain during the exercises and things like that. So the first thing we did, Harley, was assess this in the clinic, didn't we? So we tested these grips in the clinic and actually sort of built up the load itself to the point that we were comfortable with that. And the way that we decided is it's okay to get a bit of discomfort during these exercises, and that's a good way of knowing when the load is kind of appropriate but not too much. Obviously, the different grip types will allow different levels of load, so you need to test them all. And the most important thing is that you don't irritate the finger. So a little bit of discomfort at the time, 1, 2 out of 10, maybe even a 3 is absolutely fine, as long as after the session, in a few hours after the load-in, the finger feels pretty much as it was or back to normal, and certainly 24 hours afterwards it hasn't irritated or become more painful, or for example the next time you do your lifts it feels a lot worse. And then in terms of knowing when to progress, it's very different for different people. The principle of rehab in general is progressive loading. So you want to increase the amount of load on the tissue over time so that the body will adapt to that load and get it stronger and more load tolerant. So usually we find that people increase the load around about every 2 to 3 days, because again, you're doing this loading every day. And how much you increase that load by is kind of up to you. The grip types will be different, but usually again, people increase it by between 2 and 3 kilograms each time that they are loading. But don't get fixated on having to do that. You might in your rehab get a little bit of a plateau, and that's absolutely fine, and then you can increase it a little bit of a later date. The last thing to say is about the progression of the duration of the hangs. So for example, as you increase the weight, say we're getting up to maybe 20 kilograms added for these different grip types, doing that for 30 seconds becomes quite fatiguing really, and that's the main thing that's stopping you progressing. So what we would usually do in the rehab is bring down the time, what we call time under tension. So we'd mostly keep at the same sets and reps. However, you would bring that time under tension maybe down to 20 seconds and then maybe down to 10 seconds as you're getting up to higher loads. And that's more in keeping with potentially how you would train on a normal overhead fingerboard. And that makes that transition into that a little bit easier as well.
So one of my questions at the end of that rehab protocol was, when could I start dead hanging again?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we get this a lot really, people asking us, when can I stop rehab and start training? And I think what they really mean by that is, this is the training I was doing before I hurt my finger, when can I get back to that? And I think what's important to understand is it's not kind of just two separate things. Rehab and training really are the same sort of thing. You just come in from a different sort of level of intensity or starting point really. So if you think about it, when we were rehabbing, we were trying to put an appropriate load through your finger and progress that load so that the tissue adapts, becomes stronger, more tolerant to stress. But that's exactly what you're doing with training. We just call it strength training. Do you know what I mean? Because you're doing exactly the same thing. You're adapting the muscles, you're adapting the fingers, and things like that. But so it's not a case of thinking, well, when can I stop this and start that? There's this sort of transition into it. And it's the same with on the wall as well. You know, when can you get back to board climbing? When can you get back to high intense stuff like campusing? This is always the questions we have, but you have to almost break it down and try and, again, that same principle of progressively building it up.
Oh, well, it was fascinating talking to you today about rehab. Thanks for coming in, and thanks for following along at home. And if you're interested in getting a quad block for yourself, there's a link in the description below. If you liked what you saw today, please hit subscribe, and we'll see you next time.